welcome everyone, and I hope you enjoy tonight's discussion. Our doctor is Christa Ellsworth. She's a doctor of pharmacy. Let's see. She is at the managed care pharmacist at St. Joseph Heritage Health. Her talk tonight is going to be on the cost of drugs, which have become a huge problem in healthcare in the US. It involves the health insurance, drug manufacturers, government agencies, foreign drug companies, and safety. Dr. Ellsworth deals with these problems on a daily basis and will give us insights and methods of dealing with these issues. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ellsworth, and she'll be giving the presentation tonight.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I am so pleased that this many people came to listen to me. You know, I'll be the first to admit that drugs and the safety of drugs and generic drugs are maybe not the most interesting topic. So I'm so happy that you're all here today. So can everybody see the beginning of my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay, let's just jump in. I just want to start with talking about maybe like what not necessarily this talk is going to be about and what it will be about. So I didn't necessarily want to make this talk about why our drug prices are so high. You know, we can talk about that like the rest of the world forever. And it's mostly finger pointing. You know, the pharmaceutical companies blame health insurance companies and the pharmacy benefits managers, or PBMs, they're sometimes called. You've probably heard those in the news. Insurance companies and PBMs blame big pharma. So it's always just pointing back and forth. And the truth is obviously somewhere in the middle. But ultimately, it's the patients who suffer, and no amount of coupons, discount programs, or even government intervention is going to help solve this complex problem in the near future. So what I wanted to talk about is one solution that we have, and that's generic drugs, how they help us control costs, but also discuss safety and how our drug supply is evolving as our economy has become more and more globalized. So what questions will we be asking and answering tonight? First of all, brand versus generic. What's in a name? From where do our drugs come? How do we deal with drug safety issues? Are generics safe? And how do we protect ourselves? So hopefully we'll have some actionable items by the end of tonight that you'll find useful for your knowledge. So to start out, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about me. The video is not very good. You can kind of see me here, but this is my picture on a good day. This was before COVID and before I had to learn how to cut my own hair and my husband's hair. So luckily we're still married, but it hasn't always been great in the last 6 months. So I received my Doctor of Pharmacy degree from Ohio Northern University. I was born and raised in Ohio, and I became a Southern California transplant about 7 years ago. I'm board certified as a pharmacotherapy specialist, and I have experience in retail pharmacy. I spent about 9 years as an inpatient hospital pharmacist. I've worked for a pharmacy benefits manager, doing drug information and clinical decision support. And I'm currently the managed care pharmacist for Providence St. Joseph Heritage Health. And that job entails trying to balance quality and controlling costs. And as you know, that's a difficult balance to strike, but it's especially important for our healthcare systems these days. We need to be able to take care of our patients as best we can while trying to control costs so that we can continue our mission. I have 2 dogs. Hopefully you won't hear them tonight. They're in another room. I have one husband, and hopefully you won't hear him tonight. He's in another room as well. And I have an old house, and hopefully you won't hear anything crashing in that. You can probably figure that most of my time and energy is spent taking care of the old house and my 2 dogs. So, my husband is on the bottom there. As a side note, tomorrow is our anniversary, so we'll be celebrating this weekend. But to start out, I wanted to start with a pharmacy funny. I'll be the first to admit that pharmacy is probably not something that you associate with jokes, but I thought this one was cute. A pharmacist is going over the directions on a prescription bottle with a patient. Be sure not to take this more often than every 4 hours, the pharmacist says. Don't worry, replies the patient. It takes me 4 hours to get the lid off. And since we're not in the same room, I have to laugh at my own jokes. So let's start with some facts, specifically about generic drugs. In the United States, 9 out of 10 prescriptions filled are for generic drugs. That's a huge number. In general, the cost of a generic drug is 80 to 85% less than its brand name counterpart. And here's the most surprising statistic. Generic prescription drugs saved the US healthcare system $293 billion in just 2018, so that's just 1 year. And over the past 10 years, we've realized a savings of $2 trillion just by using generic prescription drugs. So, what makes a brand name drug a brand name drug? And what's the difference between it and a generic? So let's start at the beginning with the FDA approval process. So the FDA approval process for brand name drugs has 5 steps. The first step is always discovery and development and happens in the lab, where researchers try to find new ways to treat diseases. Thousands of compounds may be tested, but typically only a few look promising and merit further study. So those jump to the preclinical research phase. And this is where they undergo lab and animal testing to continue understanding safety and effects of the drug. If things go well there, then they move to the clinical research phase. This is where the drug is tested on humans and multiple phases of trials begin. So this can continue for years. The clinical research phase is often very long. If the drug makes it through all of that and looks to be effective and safe, it will move to the FDA review process, where FDA teams thoroughly examine all of the submitted data related to the drug and decide whether to approve or not to approve. When the drug is approved, we're still not done. There's always post-market monitoring that is done because the true picture of a drug's safety evolves over the months and years that the product is available to a wider population. So as you can imagine, this process is an investment in time and money. So what do these companies that invest in this process get? Exclusivity. As an incentive to create new drugs and recoup investment, companies are given 5 years of exclusivity, meaning that no one else can make that drug. There are additional exclusivity incentives for drugs that can treat rare conditions and for drugs that are created into new formulations. And then there's even more exclusivity perks for drugs studied in pediatric patients and for antibiotics. All in all, exclusivity is an important tool to encourage innovative drug development and for drug companies to make money. So that's why I would say that the United States has very, very good research and development when it comes to drugs, because the perks for getting those drugs to market, especially in the United States, is very, very good. So I think you can do the math. Companies want to recoup the amount of time and money invested into new drug products. And while they have exclusivity, there is obviously no competition. So we have high prices. So what's the best way to combat these types of high prices? Well, of course, competition. So enter generics. They'll provide the competition to decrease prices. But if they have to do all of the clinical testing that the brand name drugs do, what's the incentive to make a generic? Won't it be a lot of time and money to make a drug that you'll then have to sell at a cheaper rate in order to be competitive? This seems to be the fundamental problem in a model like this. So that's why we have the abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA, to allow for generic drugs to apply for FDA approval with a shortened approval process. So this was our brand name FDA approval process. So what does the ANDA eliminate? Well, we've eliminated the need for discovery and development because the drug has already been discovered and developed. We just want to make a copy of it, really. But we also eliminate the preclinical research and this long clinical research phase. The generic manufacturers only have to produce bioequivalence studies to show that the drugs are similar to the brand drug. And we'll discuss that in a moment. So for a generic to be approved via the abbreviated new drug application, it must have the same dosage form as a brand name drug. So if the brand is a tablet, it has to be a tablet. If it's a capsule, it has to be a capsule. The same strengths, the same route of administration. So if it's an oral drug, it has to be given orally. You couldn't change it to say, a rectal administration. And it has to have the same quality, safety, and performance characteristics. And those would be tested in the bioequivalence testing. However, some differences can exist. So a generic drug needs to meet bioequivalence, but the definition of bioequivalence for the FDA in this situation is between 80 and 125% of active drug in the bloodstream. Non-active ingredients in the tablets or capsules or whatever formulation it is can be different, and delivery systems are patented separately. So let's talk about each of these and what that means. So for bioequivalence, the range seems big, right? 80 to 125%. But it's only really a problem for drugs that have what we call a narrow therapeutic index. These are drugs where you have to strike a careful balance between efficacy and safety, and the range is not that big. For a lot of drugs, dosages can vary widely, and you won't necessarily get hurt if you take a higher dose. But for some, a very small increase or decrease in drug concentration can have major effects on the drug's efficacy or can cause toxicity. The most common narrow therapeutic index drugs are digoxin for heart failure, levothyroxine for thyroid, warfarin as an anticoagulant or blood thinner, and some seizure drugs. You can see if a product had 125% of the amount of levothyroxine, for example, versus the brand or another generic product, that could cause problems. So it was agreed upon by the FDA about 10 years ago to tighten the bioequivalence range allowable for these generic narrow therapeutic index drugs. So switching to generics from brands or among different generic manufacturers is much safer now than it used to be. Another interesting difference between brand and generic drugs is that non-active ingredients can be different. So that means that these items, these tablets, capsules, injectables could have different fillers or colors in the tablets or capsules. This will not affect the active drug, but it is a concern for patients perhaps with allergies or sensitivities. Perhaps a patient has an allergy to a dye, like very high sensitivity to a dye, and the patient had a white tablet and now they have a pink tablet, and that dye, causes them issues. Or perhaps a patient has lactose sensitivity, very sensitive to lactose. That has happened before as well. You don't realize that maybe the original brand name did not have lactose as a filler in a capsule, but maybe the generic does. It won't affect the active drug and it won't affect most people, but for those who are very sensitive, you have to look at the inactive ingredients as well. And delivery systems in brand name drugs are patented separately. So this is those drugs that are extended release, time release, delayed release, those drugs that have XR or ER after the name. The delivery system that's used in those tablets or capsules is patented by the manufacturer. So when the generic manufacturers go to make this drug, they have to make their own time release or extended release mechanism. So they could be different and they could produce slightly different levels of drug at different times. So say you have a drug that lasts over 8 hours and the brand name might be very, very steady over that 8 hours, but perhaps the mechanism used for the generic drug, you might have a slight spike at hour 2, and then it might go down a little bit. So overall, it meets bioequivalence, but there could be some slight nuances in that time frame. So some patients do notice a difference if they've gone from a brand name extended release product to a generic, and it's likely due to a slightly different delivery system. Now, that is for part of the FDA review, but then like all drugs, there is post-market monitoring for generics. This is an infographic from the FDA website and explains the different ways that generic drugs continue to be evaluated. Manufacturers are expected to report any problems or serious adverse effects to the FDA for evaluation. The FDA will periodically monitor and inspect manufacturing plants and monitor drug quality. Any changes to a generic product need to be evaluated by the FDA. And the FDA has an adverse event reporting system that's monitored and used to investigate concerns related to generic drug product quality. So now that we know how drugs are approved, both brand and generic, we need to know where they're made. So this may be surprising to you, but as of August 2019, about 70% of establishments manufacturing active drug ingredients for the US market were located overseas. Active drug ingredients are the active chemicals in the tablets or capsules you take. Those are then made into the finished drugs, so the actual physical tablet or capsule, and more than 50% of establishments making those finished drugs for the US are located overseas. So we're looking at the majority of our drugs coming from outside of the United States. And this includes both brand and generic drugs. So really the information that we're discussing tonight applies to both types. So here's a map with the 10 countries with the most foreign drug establishments shipping to the US as of March 2019. You see that Canada, Japan, South Korea, and several European countries have quite a few manufacturers shipping to the US. But by far, India and China are where the largest amount of our drug products are made. And this chart is another way to look at it. On the left, the percentage of active pharmaceutical ingredients, it's abbreviated API here, but those active ingredients made in different countries for the US. And on the right, the percentage of finished drugs made. So you see that the percentage of finished drugs made in the US is about 46%, but you look at the active ingredients and it's only about 26% made in the US. So it's sort of like your phone or your car. They're put together, perhaps in the United States, but the ingredients are coming from other countries. So even if your tablet or capsule is finished in the United States, the active ingredients likely came from outside of the United States. That's something that not many people realize about their drugs. So let's talk about FDA manufacturing site approval. Obviously, that would be important in situations like this where so much of our drug supply is coming from outside of the country. The FDA is responsible for overseeing the safety and effectiveness of all drugs marketed in the US, regardless of where they're produced. However, there are some key differences when we're talking about domestic site inspections versus foreign site inspections. Almost any industry experiences inspections, and typically those dreaded inspectors show up with no notice. So you get that pit in your stomach when the inspector appears at the door and flashes their badge, even when you know you've done nothing wrong and you're following all the rules. But obviously that surprise is good, keeps everybody on their toes. So when the FDA inspects domestic sites in the US, no notice is given. That's surprise inspection. However, for foreign site inspections, there is often quite a bit of notice given, and that it could be months. And that's because they have to plan for visas and foreign travel, and sometimes they need to get approvals. So often the manufacturers know that the FDA is coming. And you don't want to imagine the worst, but if you know that an inspector is coming, you will of course make any problems disappear and make sure that your site looks great. There's also the issue of staffing. In the US, we have plenty of staff for the FDA to make these inspections. But for foreign site inspections, staffing is limited. FDA has a few offices outside of the US, in India, in China, in some of those countries where there are more manufacturing sites. But in general, they're often sending staff from the US to those other countries. And so that's harder, and not as many people are willing to do that. Another issue is a language barrier. Obviously, that's okay in the US, no need for translators, but for foreign site inspection, they do need translators, and the FDA does not provide their own translators. So the manufacturing sites supply their own translators. And again, I would see that as a little bit of a conflict of interest, right? You don't know what the translator is saying, or not saying, or not conveying properly. So just something to think about. And then if in the US, if an inspector finds something that warrants extra time to investigate, or they need to spend longer in a certain area, they can. But when it comes to foreign inspections, they're on a very tight time schedule and they have little flexibility. So this increased reliance on foreign manufactured drug products was concerning to many, especially in our government. So the US Government Accountability Office, sometimes abbreviated GAO, examined the adequacy of FDA inspections of these foreign sites starting more than 10 years ago. In 2008, it was found that the FDA didn't even know how many foreign drug establishments were subject to inspection, and that was due to inaccurate info in their databases. This was terribly concerning, and the FDA was told to improve their accuracy so the correct sites would be inspected in a timely fashion and to increase their inspections. So from 2010 to 2016, the FDA did just that and improved the accuracy of their databases and increased the number of foreign inspections. However, between 2016 and 2018, the Government Accountability Office found that the number of foreign inspections per year began to decrease due to staffing issues, and again, difficulty identifying which sites were actively producing drugs for the US market. And then coming to the present, in March 2020, foreign inspections were put on hold completely due to COVID. So if you'd like to read the full report, all of these findings are available to the public on the FDA website. You can just search FDA and the US Government Accountability Office. It's quite interesting reading. If you're interested in reading Government Accountability Office finding reports, but I found it quite interesting. So we see there may be an issue with foreign FDA inspections happening in a timely fashion. But what happens when safety issues are identified? So let's get into how we deal with drug safety issues. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the concept of recalls. Yeah, there are always vehicle recalls and food recalls. I mean, how many times have we had salad greens recalled over the past few years? And you may have even been affected by a drug recall. So recalls are the most effective tool to protect the public from defective or potentially harmful products. Recalls are considered voluntary actions taken by a company to remove a defective drug product from the market. While these are voluntary, they may be conducted on the company's own initiative or by FDA request. And if the FDA requests it, you'll likely comply because the FDA oversees a company's recall strategy and assesses the adequacy of the recall. So why are drugs recalled? Sometimes it's found that a drug causes physiological harm or causes other conditions aside from what it's meant to treat. So one of the biggest recalls and then removals from market in recent history was with the drug Vioxx. Does anybody remember Vioxx? It was an anti-inflammatory medication that was most commonly used for arthritis pain. After it was on the market, study data came to light that showed that Vioxx was associated with increased risk of cardiovascular events like heart attack and stroke. So ultimately, the drug was recalled and then completely taken off the market. There are also some recalls due to contaminants from the manufacturing process or improper storage. Sometimes there are cases of bacteria or fungus being found in products that need to be sterile, like injectables or eye drops. Glass, plastic, or even metal pieces have been identified in products as well. And you can imagine that this is due to the manufacturing equipment. Most of the time, these products are identified by quality control before being released to the public, but sometimes they've been made available and need to be recalled. And then this next type of recall is one that's rather new to us in the field and has come to light in the past few years. Chemical compound contamination from the actual chemical process of making the active drug molecules. In this case, the biggest culprit has been the identification of nitrosamines in medications. So what are nitrosamines? They're chemical impurities that commonly occur in water, beverages, and foods like grilled and cured meats. So we hear about nitrates in hot dogs, bologna, and that's what these are. Notice my little hot dog picture here. However, these nitrosamines are not supposed to be found in medications. Nitrosamines are classified as probable human carcinogens, but low levels of exposure are considered okay. We know that they're found in some of the foods that we consume, which I love hot dogs, so I've consumed nitrosamines. But now our medications, that's a problem. We don't want them there. So over the past 2 years, nitrosamines have been identified in some commonly used medications. angiotensin receptor blockers, sometimes abbreviated ARBs. Those are used to treat blood pressure. Zantac or ranitidine, which is easily available over the counter for heartburn. And then just recently, a little earlier this year, it was identified in metformin ER products. And then that's a first-line medication for type 2 diabetes. So how did this happen? How did these unwelcome compounds end up in our medicines? The first issue surfaced in the summer of 2018 when the FDA was informed that active drug ingredient for some generic valsartan medication was manufactured at a plant in China, and it contained the nitrosamine compound NDMA. Like we said before, this does not belong in medications. Although not entirely sure how it was introduced into the active drug ingredient, the FDA determined that it was likely from specific chemicals and reaction conditions in the manufacturing process, perhaps to increase yields, or the reuse of materials like solvents. Because it was found in the active drug component, it had been used in multiple manufacturers' finished drug products. So you can see how that leads to a wider problem. Throughout 2018 and 2019, more generic ARBs were found to have unacceptable levels of nitrosamines in them and then recalled. Patients found the drugs in shortage, were forced to switch to what they thought were unaffected ARBs, only to have those subsequently recalled. And you can imagine, or perhaps you experienced this, it was a mess for patients, prescribers, and pharmacies. So as the ARB recalls were winding down, the FDA announced that NDMA had been found in certain ranitidine products. The recalls began to trickle in from different generic manufacturers over the next months until in April of this year, the FDA requested a mass recall of all OTC and prescription ranitidine products because they found that NDMA levels increased over time and at higher storage temperatures. So in order to keep patients safe, it made sense to remove all the products for a full investigation. Then, coming on the heels of that big announcement, in May of this year, certain metformin ER products began to be recalled by their manufacturers due to unacceptable levels of nitrosamines. This case was interesting because the FDA initiated testing due to an outside laboratory's testing that found high levels of nitrosamines in many metformin products. They wrote a formal citizens petition to the FDA to have these drugs removed from the market. The FDA then did their own testing of the samples and found that only a few of them had what they considered unacceptable levels of NDMA. According to the FDA, the testing that this other laboratory used was flawed and overestimated the levels of nitrosamines in these drugs. And they went through, why the test was flawed and what it was picking up instead of nitrosamines. And it was over my head. I am not a lab scientist, but that was their reasoning and why the results were different. We still obviously have questions regarding how this happened. How many more drugs are really affected? Are there other compounds in our drugs that aren't even on our radar? How is the FDA going to stop this? But really the most important question is, what is the risk? The amount of patients that these recalls have affected has really been unprecedented. So the FDA's worst case scenario evaluation was that if a patient had been taking valsartan tainted with NDMA at the levels they identified, and they'd been taking the maximum daily dose for 4 years, which was the maximum amount of time that they estimated the drug could have contained NDMA prior to the FDA's detection, the chance of developing one additional case of cancer was 1 in 8,000. So there may be one additional case of cancer beyond the average cancer rate among those 8,000 Americans taking the max dose of tainted valsartan for 4 years. And the FDA said that People taking drugs that contain NDMA at or below the acceptable daily intake limits every day for 70 years are not expected to have an increased risk of cancer. So this is reassuring that we haven't placed our patients in much danger, but these events have shaken our confidence in our drugs. And of course, these recalls implicated generic drugs. So I guess our ultimate question is, are generics safe? And how do we protect ourselves? So I know we've discussed some things that are concerning when it comes to the safety of our drugs, and specifically generic drugs have been implicated. However, let's keep things in perspective. When we consider the percentage of our drug supply that's generic, remember 9 out of 10 prescriptions are filled with generic drugs. I think we can be confident that the drugs are doing what they're supposed to be doing and doing it safely. As a pharmacist, I'm comfortable recommending generic drugs for myself and family. So I confidently say that the majority of generic drugs are safe and effective. The availability of generic drugs has given us access to better therapies at affordable costs. But when considering some of the flaws in our FDA system, there are actions we can take to be vigilant and keep ourselves safe. So how do we keep ourselves safe? We probably don't have the option to shun generic drugs, and I don't believe that's necessary. But the number one thing that I think we can all do to keep ourselves safe in any medical situation is to know your medications and your health conditions. I know it sounds cliche, but knowledge is power. The more you tune in to how you're feeling, the more you're tuned into your body, and the more you understand what feels normal to you, the better you can advocate for yourself if something doesn't seem right. So know what your medications are for. Know what the normal side effects are. Do you suddenly have a new side effect? Does the medication seem not as effective? Did you suddenly change from a brand to a generic or to a different generic manufacturer? There may be explanations to new side effects. There may be explanations to efficacy. However, just be aware and investigate. You can follow recalls on the FDA website. All of the FDA's announcements are available to the public, and they give good, concise information, especially for lay people, anybody. It's very readable. They usually have FAQs that you can look at. And one of the questions that we get a lot is, should I stop taking my medication when it's recalled? The FDA website answers that specifically for each case. Typically, it's not a good idea to just stop an important medication without having a replacement, but depending on the seriousness of the recall, the FDA answers that. Another way to keep yourself safe is to establish a relationship with your pharmacist. And this leads into the last point. Pharmacists like to answer questions, and we love to talk to people who are invested in their well-being. You aren't a burden if you ask questions. And if you're treated like you are burdensome, just find another pharmacy. You've likely searched out a primary care physician to meet your needs. So do the same with pharmacies. Do the same with pharmacists. Your medication and your medication regimens are very important to your health overall. So you should have a good relationship with your pharmacist who's dispensing those medications, and you can talk to, and you can easily call and ask questions if you need to. They should be the medication experts in your life. And if you feel like maybe you're just a number on the board waiting for your prescription, let's see if you can find another pharmacy that will meet your needs more. I always encourage that because again, Most patients search out a primary care doctor who really meets their needs, who takes the time to listen. Perhaps you like their bedside manner. The same can be said with pharmacists. We are healthcare professionals, and we take pride in taking care of our patients. So here's a slide with some FDA resources. Now you can just Google these and they'll pop right up at the top of the search. But I just wanted you to know that recalls, market withdrawals, and safety alerts are all found on the FDA website. And they also have drug safety communications and drug alerts and statements, and these provide good detailed information. And I also wanted to talk to you about MedWatch, which is the FDA's Medical Product Safety Reporting Program for healthcare professionals and for patients. You can Google FDA MedWatch and the site comes up as the first choice. MedWatch is important because it can signal important safety issues happening in the general population. So these things might not ever be found in a clinical trial, but in the wider population, problems can appear and they won't know about them unless they're reported. So this program is for all medications, injectables, medical devices, products that are both medications and medical devices like nasal sprays, dietary supplements or medical foods, cosmetics, and for actual food. So if you ever experience an adverse effect or you feel like you're having a diminished effect from a drug, I would encourage you to report it through here. Many issues have been identified because of reports through this program. You can also have a health professional like your doctor, nurse, or pharmacist do it, but just know that you can also use this reporting system. I don't think most people realize that something like this exists, but it's really important for healthcare professionals. And finally, for anyone who enjoys reading tweets, the FDA has a Twitter account specifically for recalls. I looked at this account, and a lot of it's food recalls, which is still important for us to know about. But they also put all the medication recalls, and then you can click on them and get more information. So if you're interested, sign up and follow FDA recalls on Twitter. So I presented a lot of information tonight, and while raising concerns over some of the FDA's oversight of foreign drug suppliers and recent generic drug recalls, I hope that I also helped put your mind at ease when it comes to the vast majority of our generic drugs. But I know that I still have some questions, and I'm sure you do too. For instance, and this was kind of asked, will the FDA take a more aggressive role in overseas site inspection? How will they ensure that our drug supply is safe in the future? And this includes, both brand and generic drugs. And I do believe that the FDA is currently trying to figure that out. It's not simple. I mean, it maybe looks simple, like just inspect the sites more, but again, it's not always that simple. Are there other impurities in our drugs that we haven't discovered yet? Are there things that we simply aren't looking for? And I know this has been in the news lately in the discussion around controlling drug costs, so I wanted to include this. If drugs are imported into the US from Canada or other countries as a mechanism to decrease our rising drug costs, will they still be evaluated with the same scrutiny? They technically weren't manufactured for the US, so they wouldn't necessarily be subject to FDA rules and inspection. Something to think about, and it's something that the FDA is thinking about now. And they're considering how, if we would import drugs from Canada or other countries, how they would operationalize, keeping that drug supply secure. So I don't have answers to these questions, and I don't think anyone has answers to these questions. But however, I hope that by sharing this information, I've empowered you to stay informed and make the best choices for yourself. So I think we have time for questions. I know it's a lot of information, but I hope it was somewhat informative.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. How long does it take to a new drug to go from concept to shelf?
Well, it could be decades. It really could be decades. It just depends how long each of those phases of research takes. So I know if you get the compound out of the discovery and development phase, that could be years and years. Preclinical phase, where they're testing it in animals, trying to get it just right, that can be years. And then the clinical trial process, there's 3 phases that need to be completed typically before FDA approval. So phase 1 trials are the simpler, easier trials. What they're doing in humans is looking for what dose that they should give, looking at safety. So then phase 2 and 3 trials are larger, and they're actually looking for the efficacy of the drug. Depending on what type of condition you're treating, those trials may need to last several years to see how effective the drug is and how safe the drug is. So that's just that one phase. And then the FDA approval process can take an extended amount of time, upwards of several years. So I don't have an average. I'm sure if you look it up, I'm sure there is an average of how long it takes, but for some, it's decades. It's not a quick process at all.
Okay, Paul, you have another question?
I do. I wanted to ask a question that hits a little closer to home regarding drug side effects. Probably many of us have had the experience of starting the new drug after a month or 2 or 3. All of a sudden you realize, I don't feel that good. I'm having this side effect or that. And so I know what I do. I go onto drugs.com or some other website and I look at the list of side effects. It is very long. And sure enough, the symptoms I'm experiencing are on that list. So I start looking at alternative drugs. Maybe I even go to my doctor and say, what else can I take? And look at different drugs. And those same side effects might be on the new drugs list also. So, I'm always in this push and pull on this issue of side effects. I don't know how hard to push to look for something different, change my the scheme in which I take these drugs or the amount. I mean, I talk to my doctors, I talk to my pharmacist. I'm kind of a pain in the neck at my doctor's office, and also my pharmacist hates to see me come in, but I don't know what to do. Do you have some sage advice for me?
Oh, I wish I did. It's honestly, it's trial and error sometimes. And these side effect profiles they're immense. And a lot of that has to do with the way they report side effects in clinical trials. So any side effect that is reported in a clinical trial has to be listed and evaluated. So you'll often see that one of the side effects for drugs is like nasopharyngitis, or like basically a cold. And you have to consider, was the clinical trial done during cold and flu season? The drug probably did not cause you to get a cold, but because patients got colds while in the clinical trial, it ends up on the side effect list. So that's just kind of an interesting aside. Quite often, the side effects of the drugs that actually occur are different than what's listed. But it's good that you're aware of those side effects, and it's good that you're looking at them. Generally, for drugs that are in the same class, drugs that have the same mechanism of action, they'll usually have a similar side effect profile. So if you're having trouble with, one particular drug, it probably won't help you to go to a different one in that drug class. Sometimes it will, but typically it won't. So you would need to look at a different drug class, if there's one available. So like for blood pressure, there's many different classes of drugs to treat blood pressure, and they all work a little bit differently. You might be on multiple drugs for high blood pressure because they're all working differently. Same thing for diabetes. Different drugs work differently. So I guess that's my only advice. And you know what? Just keep being a pain and keep asking the questions. Keep doing your own research, and I'm sure I'm sure your pharmacist appreciates you, that you're invested and you're asking questions, because we would much rather talk to patients who are invested in their health, because they'll take it seriously. They're trying their best, and we love sharing clinical information because we're nerds.
Okay, we have another question. Can you briefly talk about over-the-counter vitamins and painkillers and other over-the-counter type drugs as far as the approval process? And
Sure. For over-the-counter drugs, they are approved by the FDA. So like your ibuprofen, your cold medications, anything that's considered over-the-counter, like an over-the-counter drug. Supplements, like vitamins and herbal supplements, are not regulated by the FDA. So that's where it becomes a little bit of the wild, wild west. You can look for vitamins and supplements that have been approved, that have been evaluated by third parties. So the USP is one, and it'll have a little seal on the bottle. So they evaluate the drugs for purity. So they're looking for contaminants, and they're looking for if the drug contains what it says it contains. So if it's, a supplement that has multiple ingredients in it, does it contain those ingredients at the amount it says, and there's no extra stuff in there. Beyond that, there's no FDA regulation. They'll sometimes come down on, they will come down on companies, and they'll give warnings to companies and products that have ingredients that are not listed on the labels. Often these are prescription products that are snuck into dietary supplements. So you're aware of ephedrine. Sometimes they will find supplements that have ephedrine in them, and they will put out a warning and a recall. Often for male enhancement drugs, they will often have Viagra in them, and that's a prescription drug in this country, and it should not be in dietary supplements, and that could be dangerous as well. So OTC drugs like ibuprofen, Tylenol, acetaminophen, the cold products, those are evaluated by the FDA. Dietary supplements and vitamins are not.
okay, someone asks, can you give us a recommendation on supplements you would buy? The companies rather than.
I would look for anything that was evaluated by the USP. And I believe there's another organization, and I just don't know the name of it off the top of my head. But Nature Made always advertises that they were verified by USP. So if you see that seal on that brand name in particular, and then other brand names that have that seal, I would recommend those, because you know that you're getting what is on the label and not anything extra.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Ellsworth. That was very informative.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm I'm so happy there were so many people that attended. I'm so happy with the questions that were asked. This is such a great group.